Hi, I'm farmor Aina in Duluth, Minnesota, and I'm sitting here in this greenhouse with Morten, who is visiting me from Sweden. And today is June 13th, 2014, and I'm sitting here with Eva, and Morten he wants a video of me that you guys might enjoy seeing in the future sometime. I was born in Sweden, 1943, and my mother and father were Elisabeth and Sixten Edberg, and I grew up in Långviksvallen, Tavelsjö, a very beautiful countryside. I feel I had a very sunny, happy childhood. To me, my childhood seemed like it was always sunny and good weather for some reason. It was always sunny. And when I think about my childhood, and I had lots of playmates. We were swimming in the lake there, and I'm doing this so that you will have some kind of background on what farmer's life was. I decided when I was probably about 18, 19 years old that I wanted to expand my horizon, and I moved to Stockholm. Håkan was born 1946, I think it was, and Sture was born in 1944. And we fought a lot, but we liked each other, but we were fighting a lot, just like Isabella and Isaac are doing now. And then Håkan, we were more protective of him, but Sture and we were fighting like a cat and dog, and I always had over. I was always managing to win the fights, whether it was verbal or physical. One time I really hurt him because I got a tuft of hair in my hand, and then I realized I was a little bit too rough on him. But we had a lot of fun too, not just fighting. And I remember my dad was traveling a lot for work in those days, so my poor mother, she had her hands full. Because you can imagine having a store. My mother had a store, and my dad, he worked for the Swedish power company, and he was traveling up to Gällivare a lot in that area. I don't know what he was doing there, but he was working there, and before that he had worked for the power company, Vattenfall, when they built the hydroelectric plant in Store Norrforsen. And as I said, my mother had a store, and she was a very busy lady. It was never a dull moment. Very, very little I remember of Johan. That was my mother's dad. What I remember from him was we would go to Långviken, and they lived in the little house that they have across the big house, and they lived on the second floor. And he was sitting by the wood bin, and I was so happy. It felt so nice to be with old grandpa. And he had made me a little footstool, a blue footstool. And that's what I remember of my grandfather, Johan. 1866, He was born. And my grandmother, I think she was like 20 years younger or so. Was it 13? For some reason I thought it was 20. So anyway, that was my grandmother Hulda, and she was Liljeblad before she married my grandfather. And I know very, very little of the Liljeblads. Very little. Mormor Hulda, she was a very kind, and I liked sitting with her at the kitchen table when she came to visit us. She was always telling stories about people, like the Sandströms. She would talk about them, and how Ture Sandström and Otto, my uncle, I remember that story very well, because they bought a car together. And in those days, back in the 50s, that was a big thing. So Otto and Ture, they had a car together, and then someone else she had met said their son had bought a car too, and it was they were kind of competing. And then my grandmother said, yeah, one owner and just one door, she said. But Ture and Otto, they had 2 doors because they had a passenger side door too. So it was okay to be 2 owners because they had 2 doors. So it was just something she liked to tell, that one owner, he only had 1 door in the car. And the 2 people, they had 2 doors on the car. So it was okay that 2 people owned it. So then, things like that she would tell. And she was just a good listener too. And she used to sit with a newspaper on the table, and she opened the pages in a certain way. That was grandmother's way of opening the pages of the newspaper. I had the memory of my grandfather, very, very vague, and was also by the wood bin in the kitchen. And he would walk around with a broom, sweeping the floor. Yeah, Grandpa Edberg. His name was Nils Edberg. And I just remember him by the wood bin and with a broom sweeping the floor in the kitchen. Just, that was his job, it seemed like. And then we had Grandma Edberg, Teresa Edberg. And I always remember her grinding the coffee and the beautiful smell of the coffee when she was grinding that coffee. And also she used to have roasts. She would bake roasts in the oven, and it smelled so good in her house. And then she didn't have running water. She had a pump that she pumped water with. So that was kind of exotic for us, because we had running water where I lived. And then, what else do I remember from her? Yes, my mom and dad would have Sture, Håkan, and I stay there when they went away for the weekend to visit wherever they were going. Who knows? But we would stay with Grandma Teresa, and they would just disappear. They wouldn't say what they were going to do. They just left. And I would spend the whole weekend looking for them. And it did not feel good, looking for Mom and Dad. So I always teased them about that they should never have done that. They shouldn't have just have taken off, because that was hard on us. On me, at least on me, it was hard on me. Sture and Håkan probably didn't care. There was only about... She was born 1898 or something. 1898. And my father was born spring of 1915. So you do the math. She was a very, very young mother. So in other words, she was so much younger as a grandma than my mother on my mother's side. Because on my mother's side, my mother was the 3rd youngest of 12 kids. So you can imagine what a difference it was in age between my paternal grandmother, Teresa, and my maternal grandmother, Hulda. It was like, it could have been mother and daughter, those two. So, but I never felt that my other grandmother was that much older. I never thought much about it. But she was a lot older. So she never babysat us, so to speak. She never had to babysit us. But Grandma Teresa, she did babysit us. And I thought she was very nice. I really enjoyed her. And I loved laying next to her when we were sleeping. I would sleep next to her, and it felt good to sleep next to Grandma Teresa. Felt secure. And I think about that when Isaac sleeps at my house and he wants to sleep in my bed. It makes me think of Grandma Teresa and me and the way it felt. So I know that Isaac feels that way too when he comes to stay. The same with Isabella. Well, as I said, when I grew up, it was always sunny and fun and good weather. And running around, we were probably very dirty. I know we were. Because I remember looking at myself once in the summer. I looked at we used to have something called lidstycke. And I looked at it and I thought, well, this is really dirty. And because we had been playing in dirt, we had been playing in sawdust, we had been playing in, who knows, we went into the barn, jumping around in the barn in the hay, and pretending my friend Gunilla's home that was, she was my age, a year older. They had a farm and they had cows. So I would go up to the skuln, we called it, and they had an outlet up there with air from the barn, from the cows, and it was stinky air. But we would pretend to play hairdresser with that air that came out. So you'd sit there and the hair would, we would pretend to be hairdressers. So that was Gunilla's home. And then we have Barbro. They lived kind of next door to us, just across the field. And we would just kind of run across the field. And she was my age. And they had a playhouse in their yard. And we would play store. And being that my mother had a store and I would have to have help once in a while, I always wanted to be the one buying stuff. I didn't want to be the storekeeper. I wanted to be the one shopping. So I wonder, and then we had a lot of fun. And her mother was very particular. Things had to be nice in their house. And we would play, and her older sisters would of course help keeping it neat and nice. And it was always very nice and orderly. And when we were there, when they came in the house, after we had been there, they would always say, "Oh my God, what a mess." And I would look around and I'd say, "I don't think it's messy. I thought it looked pretty normal." For me, it was normal. But they were complaining because it was so messy when we had been there playing. So I have a feeling that I was known to stir up trouble or something. I don't know why it got messy when I was there. So that was Barbro. And then we have Monica. I was very close to her too. And her mother would, Monica and I were the same age too. And Monica's mom, she was a seamstress. And we would, she was an excellent seamstress. And Monica had very good taste when it came to clothes. So when Monica got a dress, and I thought it looked nice, I wanted one just like it. So my mother would have to go and buy material. And Monica's mom had to make me a dress similar to Monica's dress, because I wanted what Monica had. So I was kind of a copycat. But it was fun to go there too, because Monica's mom had a certain smell too, and the reason I knew how she smelled was because when she fitted my clothes, she was very close to me, so I would smell what she smelled. It was a nice smell, but it was just, that was Tanceres. That's how she smelled. And they were always so worried about pins being on the floor, because Monica had a little brother that was just a little, baby. So they were so afraid that the pins from the fitting of the dresses would fall on the floor. So it was always, we kind of watched for that when we were at her house. And played outside a lot there, because they lived right next to Waldberget. And we would climb in the back there, and we were like little monkeys. So we would play, and I remember that's where it was shady. That was the only place in the village where it was shady, and that was right where their house was. And so they had trouble with the mosquitoes. I remember the mosquitoes there. And but it was fun. And then at the end of that, their driveway was Henrik's, and Tant Kalli lived there, and she's still living now. She's 90, she's going to be 92 this fall. I just loved Tant Kalli. She was just the nicest lady. I felt like she was kind of my second mom, in a sense. And the reason I felt that was because the first house where Mom and Dad lived when they moved to the Långviksvallen was a house where Tant Kalli and her husband lived upstairs, and my mom and dad lived downstairs. So she probably babysat me quite a bit, and that's why I felt that connection with her, because she was someone I felt close to. So I'm still close to her. I still call her. And she was just a very nice, classy, very beautiful woman. I could even see that as a child, that Tant Kalli was very beautiful. And then a few houses from there lived my faster Anna, my aunt Anna. She was my dad's sister. And I kind of felt a certain ownership there too, because she was my aunt. So I would take my friends there and ask her to make us fika. We want fika. And I would have like 3 of my friends there with me. So she would have to make fika for us, and she did it happily. And I remember another thing that I enjoyed there, that could be a little touchy, but I liked her tedricka. It was so tasty. It was the best. My mother could never make it taste as good as faster Anna's tedricka. And now since then I have tried to make tedricka, but it doesn't taste like I remember it. I have tried, seriously. And I don't know what was so special about it.
You can also talk a little bit about your scooter or moped that you got.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that when you got your moped? And explain that it was a moped or a scooter?
Well, I can tell you. When I was in high school, I didn't live at home when I was in high school. I was what they call inackorderad. Our parents, Monica, that I told you about, they lived next to the mountain there, or the berget, Vallberget. She and we shared a room in Umeå. And I think my dad felt kind of bad that I had to live away from home. And I knew how to get stuff from my dad. All I would have to do is somehow make a bet, because he thought he was always right. And I managed to get stuff that way. I would bet. And one time we were betting on something, and I said, mopeds had just become popular, especially the ones with a cover in the front, and they looked very feminine. and I was dreaming about having one of those mopeds. So I managed to make a bet with my dad, and I made him hold. I made him. I said, are you going to give me a moped if I'm right? And he said, yes, I'll get you the moped. Have I ever lied to you? And I thought, well, that was kind of a big bet. And sure enough, but I have no idea what we were betting on, but I was right. And he just said, okay, I guess I have to get you a moped. And it was gray and red, kind of a maroon red. It was absolutely gorgeous. He got me a moped. And it just that, I was 15, I think we were allowed to drive mopeds in those days. And I felt like I was given wings. Because we lived like, well, you guys, Leif, Eric, and Lars, you know that we lived about half an hour away from Umeå. So, and I was just driving back and forth Umeå with that moped, and I was dressed up. I was in high heels driving that moped. We would go to dances with the moped because another friend of mine had one too. And we were hot stuff, I tell you. Not everyone had a moped. So, anyway, and I remember these red high heels and my gray coat. And those red high heels, my dad was kind of concerned about me driving around the moped with those red high heels. That was kind of dangerous. Well, the moped could go 30 kilometers an hour. That was the maximum that a moped could speed. It couldn't go any faster than that. And I knew that my brother Sture would borrow my moped once in a while, and that was nice. I let him borrow it. And all of a sudden, that moped, I remember, would go 45. That was a pretty fast moped. And I didn't really complain too much, but I knew how it happened. He had trimmed it so that it would go 45 miles an hour instead. 45 kilometers an hour instead. And so when I saw the police or any chance that a police would be in the area, I would slow down to just go down to 30 because I did have a speedometer. So yeah, he fixed my moped. Pelé was a famous soccer player from Brazil, and I guess I knew a little bit about soccer, but not to the point where I knew famous soccer players. So I was at this dance with my moped and my friends, and this dark-skinned young man asked me to dance. So we were kind of having fun that evening, and just Pelé and my friend, I don't know who it was that was with me, and then we took pictures, and then I find out he's a famous soccer player to this day. One of the most famous soccer players to this day, ever, I'm told. And I had no idea. I wish I had been more interested in him, but I really wasn't because I was only 16 years old. So, actually 15, if it was in 58. So, I, had a lot of life to live still. Yeah, in 1959, I graduated from high school. I call it high school anyway. And then I call that school high school. But now I think they call studenten high school. So, but it was a very tough program. We had to get through 4 years of läroverket in 3 years, and I started a year younger than the other kids, and it was so condensed. It was stressful. But I managed to get through it, and I got my hat, and after all school, and then I started working at an optical shop in Umeå. Had an apartment there. Wasn't very old. And once in a while I would borrow Morten, my brother Morten, who was born in 58. And the little kid that didn't turn out to be a girl, but it was okay. I didn't care if it was a boy. But I pretended he was mine. So I would borrow him on weekends and take him to my apartment and, stroll around town with him, and pretending that I was an unwed mother, which was acceptable in those days. And then I just returned him to my mother, Lisa, and she had a free weekend, so they could do other stuff anyway. So that was what happened when I was about 16, 17 years old. And I worked for that optical shop, and I didn't like the owner. Oh, he was mean. But I stuck it out for the summer anyway. And I was so scared of working because of that experience that I didn't even dare go and look for another job. So my mother helped me out. She sent me to learn how to type, to a course for typing. And then so I learned how to type. And she was looking in the newspaper for places that might need a helper. And then she saw this ad for Grubbe, såg och hyvleri, which today is Beyers in that area, same location as Beyers. And he said, yeah, I'll send her here. I'll talk to her and see if we can help her getting a job. And she said, well, she got kind of scared after she worked for this boss that was so mean to her. And she told him what had happened to me, so that she's really kind of gun shy. So I went to Grubbe, såg och hyvleri, and his name was Allan Jakobsson. And he was the nicest guy. He taught me more stuff than you can imagine, because he discovered that I liked math. So he would have me calculate the price of lumber, because they bought it by foot. And so I learned a lot of things from him. And I worked there for a few months, and then I decided that the salary was so poor, such a poor salary. And I wanted to make more money, and then I decided I should go to business school. There was a Fitinghoffs affärsskola in Umeå, Miss Fitinghoff. She taught bookkeeping, stenography, and secretarial administrative type work, jobs that you could get after that. And it was kind of a condensed course too. And then Länsstyrelsen, Länsstyrelsen is the seat of the province of Västerbotten. They used to hire clerks from that school, and they would come and ask Miss Fitinghoff, who are your best students? And she would tell them who the best students were. And then they offered us jobs. So that's how I started working at Länsstyrelsen, because apparently I was doing well. I didn't know that. But that's how I got my job there. And I worked for the Civil Defense Department there and the Car Registration Department at Länsstyrelsen. And then I could afford to live in a nicer apartment too. So I moved into an apartment with, first it was Kristina Sandström. And we lived in one of the apartments, and then her sister lived in another apartment with some girlfriends. And then one of those girlfriends, she left the apartment, so anyway, I lived in that apartment for a while, and then I started getting more adventurous and decided that I wanted to, because Barbro, she moved to Stockholm. Well, you know, I was a little bit of a copycat. So I had to move too. So I applied for a job in Stockholm. I went through the what do you call it? Arbetsförmedlingen. What's that? It's like you know, where they förmedla. Oh, I can't think of the word in English now. An employment agency. Jeez, I can't think of the word. I went to the Swedish employment agency to apply for a job in Stockholm, and I sent in my resume and my recommendations and everything. I was very professional, and sent that to Arbetsförmedlingen in Stockholm, and then they called me back, and then they said, would you like to work for us? So I have to say, everything seemed to come to me so easily in those days. So I started working for the employment agency in their bookkeeping department. And so I did that for a while. Then Barbara was going to go to England. Well, copycat Aina. She had to do something too. But I didn't want to go to England. I decided I wanted something a little more exotic than that. So I started working on my visa to go to United States. And it must have taken me at least 6 months or more to get that visa, because it wasn't that easy. They had a quota in those days. Because to go to United States, you had to have a green card before you went to United States, and especially if you wanted to work. And I was going to work as a mother's helper, so I had to have my green card. And eventually I got it, and off I go on the airplane from Stockholm to New York. And then Monica, the other playmate I had, she had also immigrated to United States, but she lived in New York. So I decided to call her then when I got to the airport in New York, and I was going to continue on to San Francisco, because that was my choice to go. So we weren't really like we had to do the exact same thing, but it was like a one-upman, a little bit of a one-upman between us. So I felt I was one-up by going a little further. And Barbara, she ended up in London, Monica in New York, and I ended up in Los Angeles. And I'll never forget when I was standing at the airport in New York, and I was going to call Monica because I had her phone number, and I put a quarter in the telephone and started talking, and I was used to the phone telling us to put more money in when it was necessary to put more money in, but the phone never told me that. So I just talked and talked, and eventually there was no more to say, so I hung up, and the phone starts ringing like crazy because I hadn't put any more money in it. And people around me were looking, and I said to the operator, I only have paper money. I didn't know what the name was of coins. I only have paper money. I only have paper money. And I was kind of in panic because everyone was staring at me. And finally a man came up to the phone and just kept feeding it quarters. So I got off, the phone stopped ringing. But I'll never forget that kindness. I didn't know how I could thank him. And he said, oh, that's all right. I wanted to give him money, but no, he wouldn't even take it. He just he just felt sorry for this little girl, I think, standing there with a phone ringing. So that's how I started my life here in the United States, with paper money only. Only paper money, no coins. So anyway, so I hop on a plane in New York. In those days we did have mostly jet planes, so I had been on a jet plane from Sweden to New York. But for some reason, I ended up in a propeller plane between New York and San Francisco. And it was a milk flight, I think. Because it was going up and down, landing, and then flying for a little while, landing, and it took forever. So I was flying very low. So I have to say I've seen United States from the air. Then when we flew across the Rocky Mountains that I had read about in school, Grand Canyon I saw, and I sat there and then I said to myself, what the hell am I doing here? What have I done? All by myself. And then it was the first time reality hit me, because that was pretty big to take off like that as a 21-year-old. I was 21 years old, or my mother would never have let me go. So I land in San Francisco, and there comes the family that I had the job with. I was going to be a mother's helper for a family with 9 kids living in Hillsborough outside of San Francisco. And that's where Bing Crosby, Shirley Temple, and all those famous people were living in that part of San Francisco, Hillsborough. They picked me up in this beautiful Cadillac, and then they drive me home to their beautiful home. It was like being in a different world, because I came from Temple. And it was and they had the 9 kids. And, they taught me English. They basically taught me English. And the kids would be sitting in my little room. We were all crowded in there, in my little room. And they wanted to talk about everything, and they teaching me English, and it was fun. It was enjoyable. And then came a holiday that they called Halloween that was coming up. And they were telling me all about Halloween and what they did and how they dressed up. And in the meantime, I get invited to a Halloween party through some Swedish friends that I had made in San Francisco. For some reason I managed to make friends pretty much right away, because there were other Swedish maids or mother's helpers. So that's how I got to know other ladies. Or they weren't ladies, they were young ladies. And we were invited to this Halloween party. And we went to that Halloween party. And I was dressed up as a flapper. And then I met this man who was dressed up as Fidel Castro. And guess who that was? Guess who Fidel Castro was? That was your dad, Eric, Leif, and Lars. So that's how I met your dad. It was, and then we used to do all kinds of fun stuff in San Francisco. A lot of sightseeing, a lot of parties with other Swedish, Scandinavian friends, because they had a Scandinavian club there. They played soccer, the guys, and the ladies, we did other things, and we would I remember one thing we did was go to San Quentin. That was a very interesting tour we made, and it was just kind of a fun time. And your dad asked me to marry him because he was transferred to Hibbing, Minnesota, and he didn't want to go to Hibbing, Minnesota by himself. He didn't want to leave me behind in San Francisco. So he must have liked me. So I got married to him, and we moved to Hibbing, Minnesota. That was in 1965 that we got married in Las Vegas. We got married in Las Vegas. Yeah. Oh, and then we lived in Hibbing. It was a beautiful city, lots to do, but you needed money too to live there. But it was plenty to do without money, but it was expensive. And so that was the first time we lived there. Your dad, we had, how did we drive to Hibbing? Oh yeah, he had a Corvair, the one that has the engine in the back. We drove cross country with that car to Hibbing, Minnesota. But we got there. And then we rented a house in Hibbing. Very nice house. Next to Carleen. Carleen was a high school, Minnesota Street. I think it was 1117 Minnesota Street. And that was next door to Carleen. Carleen was in high school. And your dad worked for Bechtel Corporation. And yeah. I was a housewife. Went to a lot of coffee parties. It was not me. It was not my thing. So, but that's what else could I have done? It was what was expected of a wife of an engineer working for for Bechtel Corporation. And it was like a pecking order at these functions with the ladies, depending on the position their husbands had. If they were a higher level management, the more the women talked. And I was very quiet. Not that your dad was a low level, but I felt that, they all wanted a lot of, they showed I was a little bit of a snob clutch, and I didn't fit in. I never fit in the snob clutch. Your dad didn't either. So, but we played the games that they were playing. So eventually, we got transferred back to San Francisco. And that's when Eric was born. He was born in San Francisco, 1969. We had a cute little apartment then on California Street. And Bernd was still working for Bechtel Corporation, and we became very, very good friends with Bert Kydams, who, he was a very special guy. And Bernd and Bert, they had so much fun together. And I had fun with the two of them too. I was their mother, I think. Kept track of them. Because by that time, I had a baby and I wanted some order in life. And then came the opportunity for Bernd to go to Sudbury, Canada, on a project there for INCO, International Nickel and Copper Nickel, International Copper Nickel plant that they were building. And so we got transferred there, and by that time, everything, it was kind of easy to move because we didn't have that many things when we lived in that apartment. And the movers, they just packed everything for us. I didn't have to do much. They packed all our belongings and off we went to Canada. And at the time they had a strike in Sudbury, so we couldn't move into Sudbury right away, and Bechtel had a an office in Montreal. So he got a per diem, and we rented an apartment there. And I don't think he's ever made so much money as he did when we went to Montreal, because every day it was just gravy because of the per diem. And we lived there for a few months, and Eric was a baby, and then finally the strike was over in Sudbury, so we moved to Sudbury and got all our belongings and rented an apartment there. And then I got pregnant with Leif while I was there, and we decided that that apartment wasn't enough, wouldn't be big enough for us, so we rented a house there, a little house, pretty much the size of what I have now. And before you knew it, it was time to have Leif, so I went to the hospital. Then it was time to have him, and got ready to have the baby. And when I wake up, they tell me to go and look out the window. It was very hot during those days, extremely hot. And then when they woke me up, they said, "You gotta come and see this. We had a tornado go through here while you were giving birth." I had a C-section. And I guess the generators went on and everything while I was having the baby. And I look out through that. I thought they were kidding me. I said, "Is that how you wake up people in this country?" Socialized, Very nice care, though. And then they showed me the trees that had fallen outside. They were just like batches on the ground. So I guess I had to believe them. And I had taken part of the roof of the hospital. So Leif is my tornado baby. August 20th, 1970. They had a tornado in Sudbury, Canada. But now they say it was a straight wind. It wasn't necessarily a tornado. But it was bad enough. And so we lived there for then another 3 or 4 months. And then Bernd got transferred to, not transferred, he accepted a position with Hanna Mining Company. And they were the managing company for the taconite plants in Hibbing, Butler and National taconite plants, where they made pellet plants. So he accepted that position as a contracts engineer, and we moved back to Hibbing with the 2 little kids, and we bought a house there in Hibbing and lived there for a few years. And then after that we decided to build a house on Swan Lake. So we built a nice house on Swan Lake. And then unfortunately the marriage didn't make it. So, and those are things I prefer not to talk so much about. And Eric and Leif probably remember a lot about it. Lars was just a baby, but it was a tough time, both for your dad, Bernd, and for me, especially being away from family. But we got through it. Well, as it turned out, I had custody of Lars, who was only year, 79. He was only 2 years old, and I bought a duplex in Duluth on Central Hillside, and it was a tough time, very tough time. I started working at a photo shop, and made minimum wage. I even went on welfare for a little bit. And they told me at the welfare department that I don't think you're going to stay on welfare very long. And this is what welfare is for, to help people get through tough times. So I worked there at so I got that job at the photo shop, and then they subsidized helping me with rent and got some food stamps, and Bernd had Eric and Leif, and they stayed at the house on the lake, and I managed, but then I got a job at the bank called Northern City National Bank, and then as an audit clerk, because math was always my best subject in school for some reason. I had a mind that liked anything that had to do with numbers. So I thought, audit clerk, oh, that sounds good. Sounds like something I can do. So I applied for that job and got it, and worked there for a few years. And then they decided, then they needed to consolidate the audit functions for this particular bank that ended up being consolidated with First Banks. And everything got moved to the cities, like the audit division was in the cities. I didn't expect much. I figured they'll find something for me to do at the bank. But the audit director from Minneapolis, he came up and talked to everyone that got transferred to Minneapolis, and then he was asking, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm the audit clerk, and I'm kind of specialized in trust auditing because no one else wanted to do it. So I started poking around in the OCC manual and kind of reading up on it and helping the auditors when they came. So he said, well, we could use you. So he transferred me down to Minneapolis. So I got to work. So then again, everything, it was like things started to happen then. And they paid for my move, and they paid for the hotel there. And then I got a job as an internal auditor. So I went from audit clerk to internal auditor and started working with people who had a lot more education than I did, but we were, I still had the position. So I wasn't a clerk anymore. Worked hard though. Because when I had the disadvantage of not having a formal education, but I knew I had the mind to compete with them. So I just made sure that I took every single class they offered me. Anything they offered me, I took it. And I was on a lot of... So I got my education through First Bank system, I have to say that. That's how I learned a lot. That was the best school I could have gone to. So I worked there for 12 years. So I made it from audit clerk to senior auditor at First Banks. Well, what happened there is one of my auditors then that came up to Duluth for the transition, her name was Sandra McCabe, and she was a CPA, so the guy who was the head of our department here in Duluth, he kind of had to step aside so that Sandy could take over and kind of transition us to go to Minneapolis. So we became very good friends. And while she was here in Duluth and I was still working here, then we built a good friendship. And then when I moved down to Minneapolis, and she had an apartment down there, and I needed a place to live with Lars, then I said to her one day, I said, you know, when you lived in Duluth, you were never in your apartment. You were always over at your parents' place, because she was born and raised here in Duluth. And I said, would you consider buying a townhouse or something together with me? We'll buy a townhouse together. And then you and I and Lars can share the townhouse. So that's how I ended up with a townhouse on a greenhouse in Greensboro Square. It was because of Sandy and her credit, let's put it that way. It helped that she had very good credit, so we could buy this nice townhouse. But I pulled my weight too. So we lived together for, and I always told Sandy, she was very shy. I said, I have a feeling that you're going to meet your husband through me. I just have that feeling. And she was just laughing at me. And sure enough, it was through me she met her husband. And she's now Sandra Ryerson, married to Herb Ryerson. So anyway, we lived together, and we had a very nice, cozy life there. And Eric and Leif lived with their dad, and at that time he moved to Virginia. Bernd was moving around a lot, and Eric and Leif moved with him. So they lived in San Francisco for a while, and then he took them back to Minnesota, and then they would stay with me quite a bit too. We would go back and forth. He lived in Virginia and lived here in Duluth, and so we did have some kind of a relationship as a family, but it's difficult when you're divorced. Many hard feelings. So they would come down to the cities too once in a while and visit with us. And I met, well, it's so intertwined, and Carlene is there too, because she lived next door in Hibbing, and we continued to have a friendship after she completed high school, and she got married a couple of times. But we always kept the friendship going. And she lived down there too, and this is over a span of 50 years we are talking. Lots of things happen. So I don't know if I even hit on the highlights, but basically that's what happened. So I worked down there for 12 years, and finally the entire audit division of First Bank System, we were 72 auditors. We all got fired. They outsourced the audit function to Ernst & Young, the public, which we had answered to. We kind of worked for Ernst & Young too, but we did the work for them. But now they were going to do the work. So you can imagine how cursory the audits were for a long time. And we know what has happened to the banking system. So anyway, it was not very well regulated and monitored. And I can see why we have the problems we have now with the banking system. It's very easy to see. And then here I am around 50 years old then, when I got fired, along with other 70-some auditors. And I had no formal education. So I didn't expect much. I just expected to hold on to what I had. But then one day I get this phone call from people. I worked as a employee benefits accountant for both First Bank System. So I had to lower my salary expectations quite a bit after the audit division got fired. So I got a job at First Bank System as an employee benefit accountant. And worked there for a while, and my boss didn't like me at all. And I was going to go to Sweden with Jeanette one time, and he said I had to come back 2 days before my ticket was, it was just a mess. But anyway, he was so mean that I had to buy a new ticket to go to Sweden because he decided I couldn't have an extra day or two. And, you know, I was not very quiet about that he made me do that. And I had a lot of friends. So he ended up being the one who got in trouble, not me. He had said that I would be fired if I didn't show up on that date. Well, guess who got fired? So, anyway, I didn't want to work there anymore, regardless. So I started working with Norvest Corporation then as an employee benefit accountant. And I went from the fire into from the whatever you call it. It was bad. It was a bad position. Oh, anyone that knew me during those days would say that they didn't know if Aina was going to stay sane. It was that bad. And I got this call one day from a place called Mullen Consulting. And they asked if I would come for an interview, and I thought, who is Mullen Consulting? Another one of those headhunters. Because I had a lot of headhunters after me, but nothing that came into fruition because of my lack of education. So I could never get a better job. I was just kind of resigned to the fact that I'll jump from one job to another. So anyway, I go then to Mullen Consulting, and then I ask them, are you a recruiting firm? And they said, no, we are executive benefits administrators. And I thought, what? Yes, we understand that you were used to working with large corporations with many participants. And I said yes. And I had an interview with like 3 or 4 people there. They were all very nice. So anyway, I got hired as an executive benefits administrator at Mullen Consulting for a new account that they had acquired with some thousand participants. And they didn't know what to do, but they had got the job. So, and I was used to working with phone enrollment systems and things like that, computers, and so I ended up consulting them, I think. But we got it together, so we were able to manage, between me and a couple of other people at that Mullen Consulting, we managed to get the things rolling. So that was good. I really enjoyed that job. It was so exciting because I felt I was really doing something. And then they decided to close the office in Minneapolis. Jeanette, I worked, oh yeah, right before we got fired at First Banks. We were on a project in South Dakota. And that was when the Gulf War started. The day of the Gulf War, I was supposed to go to South Dakota on an audit project with 4 or 5 other auditors, and I was supposed to be the auditor in charge. And I was going to meet them at the airport, and one of them was a new employee, and her name was Jeanette Murphy. Well, on the tickets we had, there was a different name. In those days you could do that. We could just switch people. Didn't matter what name was on the ticket. On that day, they decided that the ticket had to match the person. And here comes Jeanette with a ticket that is not Jeanette's name. So that's how I remember it so vividly. And then most of the people they hired, they were just out of accounting school. They were CPAs and very 4-point, usually very bright kids. So I said to myself, oh, Jeanette Murphy, so that's going to be another hotshot CPA. I was so used to that they just thought they were hot stuff. Anyway, yeah, I respected them because they were smart, but I don't think they respected me much, most of them, because I didn't have the education, and I ended up being their boss or their leader. So that was hard for some of them. But Jeanette, she was the nicest. She never, ever showed that arrogant side like I was used to with the other ones. She never showed a sign of it. So that's how I met Jeanette, on the day of the Gulf War at the airport in Minneapolis. And that was only like 4 months before we all got fired, including me, including Jeanette. But Jeanette and I have remained friends, very good friends. And so Sandy has been a friend too. And anyway, so that's how I knew her. But I ended up taking the offer to transfer with Mullen Consulting because they offered me a transfer to LA when they closed the office. And they gave me a 40% increase in salary. Who could resist that? And I was just like, what's wrong with these people wanting me so badly? But I ended up in Los Angeles with that account that I had here in Minneapolis. Well, I ended up accepting the transfer to Los Angeles. And before doing that, they invited us for a weekend down there. And that was in the winter. It was like January, February here. And icy and cold and miserable. And they entertained us for a whole weekend, going to the finest restaurants, taking us in limos, where the movie stars were eating. We had dinners there, and they had us stay at a very fancy hotel. And then they drove us around a little bit to give us an idea of where we could live. And they took us to Long Beach. And to me, Long Beach was attractive because it was right on the beach. And it wasn't as expensive as it is in Santa Monica. The apartments that I saw in Santa Monica, what I could afford, they were nice enough, but it was not the way I felt when I saw places in Long Beach. So I ended up eventually buying a condo at International Tower, which is a kind of a landmark. It's a landmark building in Long Beach, overlooking Queen Mary and the beach, and sunny and walking paths, and it was lovely. Beautiful balcony, and it was fun to have company there because most people liked where I lived. So I even got a lot of company from Sweden during that time, living like that. And they had the Grand Prix there. But one thing I noticed when I lived there, I forgot to make plans to have fun. The only thing that I remember was that I actually enjoyed, because I took wine classes, and they were in Long Beach, within walking distance. So Monday nights, I would go to wine classes, and we would be tasting wines from 7 o'clock till like 10 o'clock. And I walked home. It was within walking distance. It was fun. And then I also had the opportunity to go on one of the class tours to Napa Valley in Northern California. That was a lot of fun. But most of the time, I ended up walking around by myself. These beautiful walk paths, beautiful beaches, and because I worked too much. I worked my buns off. I would leave at 7 in the morning, and I would come home at 7 o'clock And often I would sit on the balcony and sip wine until it was time to go to bed. Not a very healthy life. And, no matter how beautiful you live and you have your own office at the office and the money, I made good money, but nothing. And I did start saving there, I have to say that. But there was no life. And then I missed the kids in Minnesota. And I decided to quit after 5 years. I simply quit my job and moved back to Minnesota. No job, nothing. Just my savings. I was 59 years old then. And decided that it was Duluth I wanted to live. So, as you know, as soon as I moved here, I bought this house where I'm sitting now, in this greenhouse. And right away, and Eric knows that, I was at Eric's place and we drove back here and I got really sick, very sick. I didn't have a doctor here. So he took me to the doctor, to urgent care. And they said, no, she needs to go to the emergency. And then we went to the emergency department and I was diagnosed with colon cancer. Stage 3B, it's called, which is pretty advanced. So it kind of explained a little bit why I said I can't do this job anymore. I was tired, I was sick. Didn't even realize I was sick. So I'm glad that I moved because probably saved my life. If I hadn't moved, I think I would have been dead by now. Because I would never have I would have gotten sick. And I don't know. But I just have this feeling that moving to Duluth saved my life. And I have a totally different outlook on life now. It's not so important to chase money. You can make it without chasing money. Chasing money is not healthy. But I don't know why I did. It just came my way. So here I am. I have Lars living here with the 2 beautiful kids. And Eric in Minneapolis, who's just very I don't see him much, but I just feel that he is very protective of me and kind and nice to me. And then Lars and Megan and Isaac and Isabella, they're going through some tough times right now, but they'll get through it. And here I am. I have Morton here, and that's very nice. And Leif in Sweden, he decided to move back there. I miss him and his family. If I was a little closer to them, things would be pretty perfect. I wish they could come here and visit. And at least to visit me.